We're delighted tonight to introduce our presenter for the evening, Kevin Zezima, attorney at law. Kevin Zezima was born and raised in Norwalk, Connecticut, where he currently resides. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago Law School. He has practiced as an attorney with law firms in Chicago, New York, and Connecticut. Throughout his career, Kevin has worked with other top legal minds, including leading experts on election law. He's actively involved with monitoring the status of the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary, with particular attention on how the legal issues addressed in those bodies interact with current events.
I want to talk about the Affordable Care Act, which is California versus Texas. There's going to be oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court. Amy Coney Barrett's going to be hearing them. And it's a question of whether or not the Affordable Care Act can remain at all, or if it's going to be struck down entirely. Whenever Congress wants to pass a law, they have to do it. They can't just pass any law. It has to be pursuant to a delegation of power. There's a lot of different ways they can. Normally, the most expansive power is the Commerce Clause power. They have passed a bunch of laws under there. It's where all of our civil rights legislation has come from, because a lot of the places that were segregating were benefits of interstate commerce. So because they were benefiting from interstate commerce, the Commerce Clause power allowed Congress to regulate those organizations. In 2012, there was the National Federation of Independent Businesses versus Sebelius, which upheld the ACA, but it didn't under the Commerce Clause. It did as a tax. The individual mandate, if you didn't have health care, would be required that if you didn't have health care for a certain portion of that year, you would have to pay a tax. In 2017, Trump passed the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. It reduced the penalty in the individual mandate down to zero. So now you have a tax, but the tax is $0. And the question is, well, is it really a valid tax anymore when the tax is $0? Great question. It's something that if we take the Senate, all we have to do is pass something allowing for the individual mandate to be a tax again, and this whole case is mooted. If you don't, then we're in a really weird situation with the ACA. The other thing I just want to talk about a little bit is pre-existing conditions. You're not going to hear pre-existing conditions really talked about. That language doesn't get used in the ACA, and it comes up because two other provisions combine to make the protections for pre-existing conditions, and that's the guaranteed issue, which requires everyone to be issued medical coverage, and then the community rating, which prohibits insurers from charging more because you have a past medical condition. And together, those two things are really what make the individual mandate. And I just think that's important because you'll hear a lot of politicians, especially if you listen to the debates, talk about what they're doing with pre-existing conditions. And it's easy to say a lot of things, but if you actually go and read the briefs in these cases, it's not easy to say in a legal brief, this is where you're asking the court to do the thing. And what they say in the brief is really what they mean. Just taking a quick look at it, I've included two quotes just from the brief asking them to strike down the law. Basically, it's saying that even though that the guarantee issue and the community rating provisions are constitutionally valid on their own, they're saying that it's evident that Congress wouldn't have wanted them without the individual mandate, which is a really weird argument. It's asking the courts to get in the head of the 2010 Congress and see if they didn't have the individual mandate, would they still have passed the protection for pre-existing conditions? That's a hard question to answer. And then the other question is really, once these provisions fall in the ACA, or if they do, is there really anything left worth saving? And you could strike out parts of a law and a law could still be valid, but at some point it just becomes so ridiculous that the court will be like, well, we've gutted the main part of the law to let these other parts stand makes no sense. So it's really a question of, is there anything worth of the ACA left saving? And that's going to be before the court if they do strike down the rest of it. And I think for that, I'm going to leave off there and I'll let anyone ask questions if they want to.
And we do have a lot of questions. First, we're going to go live to Jim.
Yeah, my question has to do with the ACA. From what I've been reading, the argument seems to be whether the integrity of the act is still there after individual provisions are being removed. You said it had to do with the 2010 Congress and bringing back, basically, you can interview them.
Right. So I could go into that a little bit. What I would say is, when you really think about how the law was structured, when you're going to cover pre-existing conditions, the law was structured, well, how are we going to afford to do this without, because normally you would charge those people incredibly high premiums. But in order to do that, they brought everyone into the law and saying, look, we're going to bring in low-risk people. And they did that through the individual mandate. And that's kind of what insurance is. It's pooling all of the resources. So the low-risk people pay a little more than they should, and they probably don't need to. But it allowed for the government to cover the high-risk people. The question is that scheme integral to the law? Is there still a valid working scheme that could have passed Congress where they wanted to protect obviously pre-existing conditions, and it did a lot more than that too? It's a question, like the courts will call it severability. And the question is whether or not, once you get rid of this provision, does the law still make sense on a practical term? And that's how you'll hear it addressed. I mean, I don't think it's an illegitimate question. I think passing a tax that's $0 in order to fund a bill, it shows that they wanted to try and fund it. Obviously, it was a result of a huge compromise, so it's hard to go back and you could take what any senator said at the time. The healthcare reform and the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act was a huge compromise, so to figure out what Congress would have done is near impossible. So most courts, I would say, normally wouldn't get into it. I don't know what this court's going to do.
Jim, yeah, you have a follow-up, Jim?
Yeah, when the Congress passed the law, there were two pieces in which you've been discussing: inclusion and the financial. Are they linked? The intent of the law was the inclusion of people with pre-existing conditions. How it was paid for was almost an afterthought.
I think if you talk to anyone who would be a Republican congressperson at that time, they would tell you that they were worried about the financial aspect of it and they wouldn't have passed it but for having some way to cover it. And I think in theory that how to pay for it really isn't directly linked. A lot of, as I was saying, a lot of laws are covered through other just general taxes, the general fund. There's a lot of ways you could pay for it. It made a lot of sense to put it all together because it made a nice scheme. But now that you kind of got rid of one part of it, it's just a question of where's the law now, at least in the current climate.
So, Bud, you have a question?
Going back to the pre-existing condition protection, it seems that one of the possible outcomes is that the Supreme Court could say the pre-existing condition protection stands, but that's maybe the only thing that's left. If that is under consideration, I would think that the Supreme Court would ask both sides whether they believe that the pre-existing condition protection should remain or was part of the original intent of Congress. And what do you think the plaintiffs would say, the attorneys general from Republican states? What would they say about that if they were asked that question?
So I'm pretty sure you're going to hear both of those questions posed to both sides in terms of what they think about it. And I mean, they have pretty much spelled it out in their briefs. The Republican state, which is Texas in this, is saying that without the individual mandate, that the compromise that happened to pass the Affordable Care Act would not have happened. And that's their argument, that it wouldn't have been a law but for that compromise, which included the individual mandate. But I mean, as much as we talk about that, the Affordable Care Act does a lot of things. Honestly, a lot more than I know what it does. It's a huge document that affects so many different things in the medical field. So there's portions of it that are still relevant that I hope come up, but that's definitely going to be one of the main issues that you'll hear in oral arguments. And
it would seem to me that politically, the Republicans have been claiming that they are for keeping those protections, and that therefore they might want not to have to say that specific.
That's the only reason actually that I really want to delve into the language that they use, because they have said it already in their briefs. It's already said, but it's not going to make a good soundbite when you hear that, them talking about community rating and the guaranteed issue, and that's how they're going to phrase it. And you're not going to get the soundbite where they say, well, we want you to remove pre-existing conditions. They're going to say that, well, we think that the guaranteed issue is no longer a valid use, and no one's going to know what that means, and it's not going to be sexy enough or interesting enough to put on a news story. No one's going to care about it, unfortunately. So I think the political damage is not going to be high enough. And then the Republicans say that they have a plan. I don't think anyone's seen their plan that's going to cover pre-existing conditions. And they say, look, we'll get rid of this, we'll pass our own thing. Then they'll blame Biden for not passing whatever Republican plan exists or doesn't exist. And I think that's how they escape the political damage from that. That's at least my 2 cents on it.
Next is going to be Anita.
What NPR was saying today about the ACA and the argument that was going to be put forward, which had to do with the individual mandate. And I think Jim made this point. The Affordable Care Act has been working. People are still registering for buying health insurance without the individual mandate. So how can the argument be made that it's needed if it's no longer needed?
Well, I mean, I guess there's two things you have to look at. Number one, it goes back to the source of, like, does Congress have authority to pass this law? Normally, you would really think it would be under the Commerce Clause. Everything about healthcare is so interstate at this point that, unfortunately, under Sebelius, which is the 2012 decision, that was not the way the court adopted it. So it is now only a valid law under the taxing power. And you get into a weird question now that you have a tax for $0. And then, I mean, the other thing is, I don't think anyone thinks that the individual mandates needed to work it. It's just really the funding mechanism and the question of what would Congress have done without that funding mechanism? It works perfectly fine still nowadays, but it's a question of, did Congress have authority to pass it now that there's no tax? I think the whole case would be resolved and mooted. If we get the Senate, then we just pass a law restoring the tax to it, like even any kind of penalty to the ACA, and that moots this entire case before it's decided. So if we could win both Georgia runoffs, that's the world we're in, and this case means nothing. That's the best world to be in. If we're not, it's going to be a weird world to be in. I don't know what the answer is going to be. I think it's hard to say that you pass a tax for $0. You could do anything with that then. So it's concerning.
This one's from Ruth Light. Ruth wants to know, was the funding mechanism insisted on by the insurance companies?
Like, the insurance lobbyists had their hands all over this bill. I don't think that they would be insisting upon the individual mandate because it doesn't particularly help them. Like, this is all a public option when you look at it. Private insurance doesn't get anything out of having more low-risk people covered by the public option. They would rather have, like, the more low-risk people you could get into your pool as an insurance company, the better it is. Granted, they could adjust premiums enough that they make money off of anyone they get into the pool, but it's just people going into the public pool instead of into their private pool. So I can't imagine that they're a big pusher for the individual mandate, as it could be mostly uninsured people, but I'm sure there's some people who would be like, I'd get private insurance, but I could get the public option, might as well get the public option. Just seems to be more competition for insurance companies. So I don't think they would be pushing for it.
Let's go to Bud.
If the ACA is thrown out, we probably won't find out about it until the spring, May or June, I assume, when they announce their decision.
Yep.
Are they likely to give a year or two for Congress to replace the ACA or to change it so it is constitutional, so that millions of people aren't thrown out of insurance?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very real chance that something like that could happen. What they can do is, like, Supreme Court decisions will start coming in anywhere from April and usually end around July. That's kind of like decision season. What they can do is they could stay the effectiveness of that order, either by request of the party or what they call sua sponte, where the court does it themselves. They could say, this is a decision, we are staying the effectiveness until this date. And it seems to make sense that they would do that, or someone would ask that they do that, and I don't know why. I'd like to think we live in a world where they don't want people to be uninsured. I think everyone's happier in that world, but I sometimes question that anymore.
Kevin, thank you so very much.